We want to welcome now Nouriel Roubini, Chairman of Roubini Global Economics and Professor at NYU's Stern School of Business. Great to have you here for the full hour.
Pleasure being with you today.
And you've had a busy couple days. You were in Washington this past weekend when, of course, we saw some very dramatic steps being debated and discussed. What do you make of what has happened in the last couple of days and the announcement we heard this morning from our top economic leaders in Washington?
Well, last week we were one step away from a systemic financial collapse. What happened in the stock market, bond market, credit, money market was really a disaster. So something radical needed to be made. And this step-by-step approach of the authority was not working. So finally, the policymaker of the G7 got religion. They realized they were really needed to a systemic collapse. The G7 statement and then the action taken by the European Union and now the U.S. go in the right direction. We have to take a holistic, systematic approach to this financial crisis. We have to recapitalize the banks. We have to provide liquidity. We have to provide guarantees in order to avoid the systemic financial crisis. That's why the market for a day they've rallied. I think there are significant still downside risks to the markets and to the economy. I think people are going to be surprised by the severity of the recession, the severity of the financial losses. Therefore, the rally is going to sputter over the next few days.
All right, we'll talk more about the markets. I want to ask you specifically about this plan, since you, of course, early on were warning of the financial crisis we're now in the midst of. Is it going to work?
It depends very much on how it's implemented. First of all, the original plan of Paulson was totally flawed. The idea that you resolve a banking crisis by buying a bunch of toxic assets was utterly silly. Every expert of banking crisis knows you have to recapitalize the banks. So now they finally understood that. They have decided to recapitalize the banks. In my view, $250 billion is not going to be enough. If you look at the size of the capital needs of the financial system in the U.S., you'll be surprised that you'll need probably twice as much, if not as much. So I think this is going to be just the first round of a recapitalization of the banks.
I just want to jump in there. At the same time, weaker banks are not going to make it.
No, absolutely. One of the crucial things you need to do in a financial crisis is a triage between banks that are distressed but solvent, given capital liquidity injections, and those that are insolvent. If you rescue the insolvent ones, then you're going to have a bunch of zombie banks going to attract now deposit because of the guarantee, going to make even more risky loans. So the first lesson is try to close down all the smaller banks or even some of the regional banks that are insolvent. You have to decide to circle the wagon only around the insolvent ones. That's important. That has to be done very fast, especially if now you're going to have widespread guarantees on deposits, on interbank lines, on the debt of the banks. Otherwise, you're going to do the same mistake was done with SNL, where you increase the deposit guarantee. These guys started getting deposits from everywhere, and then they lent even more risky, and then the fiscal cost ended up being even more severe. So it's crucial to do the triage. A bunch of banks are insolvent. They have to be shut down. That's not clearly part of the plan yet.
Any idea how much insolvency risk there is out there for some of these banks?
Well, the FDIC says that there are about 117 banks on its kind of watch list, but IndyMac was not on that watch list until a month before it collapsed. There are some independent experts of the banking system that says about 8% of the 8,500 FDIC-insured banks are in severe undercapitalization situation. That means 700 banks. So I expect that actually the number is much larger than those in the FDIC list, and the capital needs of these banks are significant, and a good chunk of these banks are really insolvent. You should just shut them down, including some of the regional banks that are not going to make it.
Nouriel, let me ask you about what's going to be the direct impact on the credit markets. We did see some improvement in LIBOR, but do you think the plan that we have now is going to work, even if it needs more money? Are we going to finally see this is what it takes to get these banks lending again?
I'm not sure it's going to be the case. For the time being, there is still a huge amount of counterparty risk. The banks don't trust each other. You have not done the triage of closing the insolvent ones. They're not lending to the corporate sector. They're not lending to the shadow banking system. Thousands of banks who do not receive, or non-bank financial institutions don't receive directly Fed support. So I think that this credit market are going to remain clogged for a while. I don't see an improvement occurring anytime soon.
But what else could be done then?
I think that, usually we think of central banks as being the lenders of last resort, but unfortunately right now the situation is one in which the banks are not lending to each other, they're not lending to non-banks, they're not lending to a corporation. So central banks have become the lender of first and only resort. They're going to be the only ones that for the time being can provide liquidity and capital and credit to the financial system and to the real economy until things improve, until we really recapitalize the banks, until we stabilize the system. I think for the next few weeks, most of the credit is going to come from the public sector. We're effectively nationalizing the financial system directly and indirectly.
And what do you think of that?
There is no other choice at this point. I think that the U.S. is doing it very reluctantly, but we have to accept the fact that actually banks are going to need more than $250 billion. There's going to have to be direct intervention of the government. And by the way, if you're going to provide all these guarantees, you cannot say, I'm not having voting rights, I'm not going to be involved in the management. You'll have a bunch of zombie banks that are going to do risky things. You know, when these things were done in the past, then it's very dangerous. So the government has to decide that they have to essentially intervene much more directly in the provision of credit and also in the management of these companies. I think they're going to realize soon enough it's not just enough to give them money. You'll have to force them, for example, to suspend dividend payments. You'll have to force them to match the public money with private money. Much more needs to be done.
Well, what happened to capitalism?
Capitalism is going to survive, but we realized, and this is the lesson of this crisis, that if you have just pure laissez-faire wild capitalism without rules and regulations that are prudential for the financial system, financial markets are like a jungle. You need those prudential regulations supervision. That's the paradox. This administration was so extremely in the laissez-faire free market that now they've done more intervention than the Soviet Union during the communist era because we've destroyed the financial system. If we had had a much more prudent regulation and supervision of the financial system, we would not be in the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. We need now pragmatic policies towards financial markets.
It is an amazing historic period. I want to ask you, too, a big picture question here. The amount of money, you say it's going to be more than $250 billion. Perhaps we don't know the final price tag. Is this money that we can afford at this point?
There are going to be severe consequences for the U.S. Fiscal deficit. This coming year, we might have a fiscal deficit of $1 trillion, and the next year another $1 trillion if you add up all the bailouts, all the fiscal stimuluses, all these packages, and so on. At some point, the foreigners are financing the United States, Russia, China, the Gulf states, other credits of the United States, going to ask themselves, do we want double and triple amount of funding to the United States, and at which value of the dollar and which value of interest rates? Right now, interest rates for government bonds are falling because there's flight to safety, but if we're going to issue $1 trillion of new bonds this year and next year, it's going to have effects on long-term interest rates on the value of the dollar. And at some point down the line, even the AAA rating of the United States is going to put at risk somewhere down the line.
Any time frame on that somewhere down the line?
In the next, I would say, 5 years, either we're going to fix this financial mess and then we're going to start either raising taxes or cutting spending in order to reduce these budget deficits over time, not in the short run. In the short run, we need to do fiscal spending to boost the economy and save the financial markets, but we have major fiscal problems down the line. And the same thing in Europe and in Japan.
Lindsay was just mentioning Ben Bernanke. Let's start there. The coordinated central bank cuts in interest rates will not be the last ones, you don't think?
No, I expect that all of the major central banks are going to cut further interest rates. Of course, the Fed has already done 375, but the ECB has done only 50, and other major central banks have done very little. There is a severe recession in the U.S. It's going to get worse. There's a recession in the Eurozone, in the UK, in the rest of Europe, in Japan, in New Zealand, in Canada. About 50% of global GDP now is contracting, and I expect a global recession. So at this point, there has to be much more of an aggressive cut in interest rates. Of course, in the U.S., there is less to do than in Europe and other parts of the world, but I see further monetary easing to be necessary, together with stimulus also on the fiscal side.
How low should the Fed funds rate be?
During the last recession that was short and shallow, 8 months, the Fed funds rate bottomed out at 1%. I would not be surprised if in this recession it's going to bottom out closer to 0 than to 1%.
Some have argued that there's real risk in doing that. What happens if even that doesn't work? And so let me raise that issue with you, since we've seen a lot of other things not working.
Yes, that's what happened in Japan, where they ended up with interest rates at 0 and a liquidity trap because they did not clean up the financial system. They kept the convoy system of zombie banks and zombie corporates that were not restructured for a decade, and they had an L-shaped stagnation. I think we'll be lucky if we avoid that L-shaped stagnation in the United States. At this point, the recession train has left the station. This is not going to be a short and shallow recession lasting only 6 months, V-shaped. It's going to be U-shaped, at least 18 months, most likely 24 months. I see the most severe recession in the United States in the last 40 years coming ahead of us, and that's going to make also financial condition even worse. That's why I think the markets are going to stop rallying soon enough when they realize the economy is really tanking right now.